So good morning, everyone. I think some other people will be joining us, I know, but I'll just get started now for time's sake. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Helen Avery, Head of Nature Programmes at the Green Finance Institute, and this is one of the FIRNS engagement events, specifically starting your project's development. So I'm very excited and I'll introduce the panellists we're going to have in a moment. But just while people are coming in, I just wanted to put up a poll to ask you whether you do intend to apply for FIRNS funding. Simple yes or no, or undecided. So if you could fill that in while I'll just sort of give you a brief outline of the agenda today. So as I said, we're going to be looking at the real basics. What does it take when you're starting out thinking about a nature finance project? What are some of the pitfalls? What are some of the tips we can give? I'm thrilled to say that we're joined by Dan Hurd, as a principal in nature finance. I'm sure many of you know him today, to talk about that. And also Simon Wightman, funding manager and lead of Our Natural World at the Esmée Fairbairn Foundation. Both Dan and Simon have seen projects in development from many years ago, before we got to where we are now in terms of nature markets. So they've really got an amazing sense of what it takes to get a good project up and running. What are those starting things that you can do? What does a good application look like? How you can avoid some of the complexities. And so really looking forward to that conversation in a moment. Before we invite them on, I just wanted to again mention the investment readiness toolkit that we have. We'll put the link in a moment. So today's webinar really aligns to that milestone 1, so that initial project scoping. So even if you have put in an EOI and then you're going to move to an application stage, or you didn't put in an expression of interest and you are just going straight to the application phase, I think it's always great to sort of revisit that initial project scoping and sort of understand what lies ahead of you. So please do take a look at that if you haven't already. I wonder if we could just close the poll. I'm not able to see the results at the moment, but I think we'll come back. Oh, no, they're there. So great. About 50% of you are going to be applying for FIRNS. 3 of those who voted are not, and there's still some undecided. So it's just really helpful for us to know who's here and how to tailor the discussion today. So thank you very much for that. But before we invite Dan and Simon on, I wanted just to reintroduce you to the FIRNS application process. And so we're very happy to be joined by John Utley. He is he leads on private investment and natural capital markets for NatureScot, and obviously is a lead on the FIRNS fund. So over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Helen. It's good to be back. Well, I've lost count now of how many FIRNS webinars we've had, a few to go. It's been a great process so far. So really pleased and excited to be working with GFI on this. It's great to have Helen and Phoebe's support. We're also working very closely with the Lottery Heritage Fund, who are co-funding, who will be co-funding projects, successful projects, and obviously also with Scottish Government. So the purpose of FIRNS, just in case you need a reminder, is boosting innovative finance of nature restoration and natural capital growth in Scotland. And there are a few key words I just wanted to mention. Innovation, the second time I've mentioned that already. New business models to generate revenue from nature, platforms to enable efficient and transparent trading, new codes, new standards to provide integrity. The second word, integrity. We want you to deliver, I should say, real measurable environmental benefits, making genuine contributions to addressing the climate nature crisis. Just transition, really important here in Scotland, as I'm sure you all know. Think about things like inclusion, collaboration, equitable outcomes, community wealth building. Revenue, I've mentioned revenue already. Revenue is really important because if you're going to get investment into a project, you're going to have to pay it back, I'm afraid, in most cases. So revenue is really important. How do we generate revenue from nature? And I suppose that's really the nub of FIRNS. And scale. You know, we can't afford to tinker around the edges. We need to move. We need to do this at landscape scale, and we need to do it at catchment scale. Not necessarily right away, but whatever ideas we come up with need to be scalable. We need to be able to apply them at scale in Scotland. So let's do it. So I also want to thank everybody here who's submitted an expression of interest. The window for that closed last week, and we got over 70. So lots of really high quality ideas that we'll be looking at over the next 3 weeks and supplying feedback to help you with applications. And we really look forward to receiving our applications along with the Heritage Fund over the next couple of months. The deadline is on the 16th of June. And just a wee reminder, so you can apply for market and investment readiness grants. So that's like the big grant, if you like. Those are up to 120,000 from each of Nature Scot and Heritage Fund. If you need time to develop your ideas and your capacity and your expertise, then you can apply for a development grant of up to 50,000 from each of ourselves and Heritage Fund, and that will help get you ready to put in an application and run a full project in 2024. There's further details on the FIRNS website. I'm sure that will be posted in the chat at some point. Or you can just Google FIRNS Nature Scot and it should be the first result. So maybe let's just refresh ourselves where we are in the timeline. Going to the next slide, Phoebe. So here we are in the kind of dark green bit. We've just passed 17th of April. Next stage is to provide all of our feedback on your expressions of interest by the 15th of May. As I said, applications by the middle of June. The application form is on the website, so you can download it and start to work with it in advance of getting feedback. And we hope to announce successful projects in the middle of August once we've been through the assessment process. And of course there'll be more webinars running. I think we've got another 3 to go. Those will probably get mentioned later. I think that's enough from me for the moment, so I'll hand back to Helen for the rest of the webinar. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. And we're just changing the settings so we can all post and share, but the links to the application will be up just momentarily in the chat, and we'll post them a couple of times throughout and also at the end. So over 70 expressions, which is really exciting. So very delighted to invite Dan and Simon now to join us. We're going to just have a real conversation about, as I said, sort of the opportunities, but also challenges when you're starting out on the journey, and what to think about as you're preparing for not just your project, but an application. And Simon and Dan have tons of experience in looking at applications. Both have also worked on irons along with John as well. So I think first, maybe we'll just invite Dan, and just wanted to say to everyone, there's going to be plenty of time to ask questions at the end to Dan, John as well, and Simon. So please do, you can submit them in the Q&A function as usual. You might be able to submit them in chat. I'm not sure, Phoebe's having a look if we can change the back end so you can put them in there too. I know some people like to use chat as well. Or you can raise a hand and we can take you off mute. So there's 35 of us here today, so it's a lovely number for us really to have a conversation. So firstly, coming to you, Dan, and I'm really excited to have you join us today. You are a bit of the, I always think, oh, I don't want to say the grandfather of nature FIRNS, that would age you, and that's not the case. Godfather, I don't know. But you were involved in some of these really early projects, formerly at Triodos. One of them was Trees for Life, which we heard from in the community session. So I thought, just for those who don't know you, if that's even possible, could you just sort of share a bit about your experience working in this sector and working with projects before we sort of start to get all that wonderful learning out of your head and to everyone? Are you just on mute?
Certainly, Helen. Yeah, I prefer the godfather to the grandfather, by the way. But no, So yeah, welcome everyone. It's really nice to be here and talking to you. Hopefully have a good session later on. My background is obviously in the finance industry. Prior to being a consultant, which I am now, I worked for many years at Triodos Bank, where I was head of the corporate finance team. Probably about 3 or 4 years ago, we got interested in how this whole government agenda of bringing private finance in to restore nature. So we worked quite closely with Esmée Fairbairn Foundation actually and DEFRA. And tried to identify 3 or 4 really early stage pilot projects where we could try to learn if this whole thing was possible or not. And the answer is it is possible, but it is very difficult. And there's a hell of a lot of hard work and learning that needs to be done. So this is 3 or 4 years ago, but we have now got some sort of good case studies starting to come through. Obviously, some of you may know the Wire Catchment Natural Flood Management Project. That was one of the very earliest pilots. So that took 2 years in development, and we did manage to complete that. And we're now using a lot of the learning from that project to try to do some scale ups. So I'm very positive about this whole space. It isn't going to happen overnight. We're not going to be bringing 15-20 billion pounds of private money in the next sort of year or two, but we need to start somewhere. So that's it for me. And about a year ago, I decided to call an end to my corporate sort of life and dedicate myself full time to this sector. And I'm working with the Rivers Trust and a few other NGOs in England and Scotland, actually, and also supporting Esmée Fairbairn on some of the projects that Simon's team have funded. So I'm seeing quite a lot of different projects at different scales, all trying to do different things in different landscapes. But there are some quite generic learnings and processes, I would say, in a nature-based project. And I think that's something I could probably share with you this morning. So shall I carry on with that, Helen, or do you want to?
Yeah, no, I think that would be great. I mean,
yeah.
I wonder if it's even worth starting, because you and I have talked about this a lot, about the difference between, while we call it investment readiness, what is it actually that projects are seeking to get to? Maybe it's just a sort of a first outline, and then sort of talking about that journey and how you move it along.
Yeah, I think a useful way for people to look at private finance, we often call it investment readiness. We talk about billions of private investment. The reality is what we're saying, I think, both English, Scottish governments, UK governments, is public sector funding alone can't restore the environment of nature at the pace we want to do it. So the private sector, in whatever form, has got to play some sort of role. So that could be large corporates buying ecosystem services, so creating a private sector revenue stream, if you like, that can come in and help restore the environment. It could be members of the public buying ecosystem services or experiences. I mean, the new rewilding centre at Trees for Life at Dundregan, that's an example of a nature-based project which is going to generate a private revenue stream, and that's from members of the public visiting, buying coffee, doing tours, staying overnight. That's private revenue. That's entrepreneurial behaviour by an NGO. It could also mean investment funds investing capital in projects where things need upfront funding, but that capital is obviously got to be repaid over a period of time. So you still need a revenue stream to repay the upfront capital. So what I'd say to you all is it's not all about raising money, raising capital. Raising capital is a means to an end. Ultimately, you're going to need to generate a private revenue stream to actually create a sustainable business. And that should be the focus. So try to think about revenue as a bit different from private capital. You definitely need revenue. You may or may not need private capital.
It's a really important point, and just sort of building on John's introduction as well, because I know in the past we've seen ideas come together that are very ambitious and sort of we want to do a bond, and we often say it doesn't have to be quite so wonderful if it is, but maybe just sort of it can be simpler than that, just about that creating that revenue stream. So thanks for clarifying that, Dan. So what are some of the key things you might recommend then having in place when you're kicking off a project in earnest and thinking about this early application phase and the sort of initial phase?
Yeah. So I've thought of 5 things which I think might be quite useful, because most of you on this call will be in the same situation. You'll have put an EOI in, or you're making an application, but you're really doing a startup project and something you probably haven't done before. So that's where everyone is. And I think there's maybe 5 things to grab hold of. I think the first one is more of a behavioural one, actually. What you're all doing is essentially creating a new business from scratch, because you're looking to generate some private revenues. So you're going to need some sort of personal characteristics, I would say, to make a success of this. And I think things like entrepreneurial behaviour, left field thinking, resilience, positivity, being prepared to take one step back to take two steps forward. That's my experience on all the projects I'm working on. They are entirely not straightforward. Your initial plan will take quite a lot of delivering, and you're going to need to be quite, I think, resilient and flexible, really, to be successful. So I think go into it with your eyes open. This isn't a case of maybe what many NGOs might be used to, is applying for a grant and delivering a project and doing it really, really well. This is very different to that. You are trying to develop a business from scratch and trying to do something which many other projects in the UK are also trying to do. So don't give yourself a hard time, but be prepared for some hard work, I would say. So that's probably number one, a behavioural thing. Number two is really knowing what you want to deliver. Obviously, you'll put a compelling application into FIRNS, and we all want to get things to scale, but scale's not going to happen overnight. But you probably need to demonstrate some ambition towards scale to actually successfully secure a grant from FIRNS. But in my experience, most things start through with something smaller, something piloting, something which you have to try on a smaller scale to make it work. And then you can scale up that methodology and that learning and gradually build the project to a meaningful scale. So there's nothing wrong in saying, look, actually, the first phase of this project is a proof of concept. We want to deliver something within the next 2-3 years. But by year 10, if this works, we could have something at a much larger scale. So I think don't be frightened of thinking that you do need to actually achieve something at a lower, smaller value earlier on. And what you may find is that some of the buyers and landowners are more prepared to support you in something which is more pilot in nature, where the risk level for everyone is a little bit lower. And then you can work out what works, what doesn't, and then scale what works. So that would be number two. Don't think you have to create a £1 billion project overnight, is in a nutshell. I think number three, everything we do in the nature space has to be on someone's land. So I think one of the most important things I've learned in the project is really understand the landowner perspective. And I think that sometimes is overlooked because a lot of land is obviously privately owned. And those of you in the NGO sector, governments, people like me from finance background, great ideas about projects, but do we really, really understand the drivers of the landowner and why they might be resistant to tree planting or peat restoration or more nature or changes in their farming or existing land use activities? So it's really important to actually achieve anything to really understand those landowners. It might be a single landowner, it might be a group. And it might be that you need to reach out to people who those landowners trust and talk to. It might be that you might have to talk to land agents, or maybe a local NGO who's got relationships with those landowners, or maybe a farm facilitation group. So really think about, what's the best route to actually have a proper conversation with landowners and find out what barriers you're going to need to overcome to actually get them to agree to your project. So I think that's number three. Don't underestimate landowner drivers. Number four, pretty obvious one, as I mentioned up front, you need to generate a revenue stream from somewhere, because without a revenue stream, you're effectively creating a business with no sales. If you've got a business with no sales, you haven't really got a business, have you? So all these projects need to generate some sort of revenue stream. So that is the overriding thing you've got to be thinking about all the way through developing your project. Where is that revenue stream going to come from? Even if actually on day one, it's quite a small revenue stream that could scale, you still need to be focused on that. So it's revenue stream before investment for me. And the fifth one, I think, is just more of a practical one. What I've found in some of the projects I've worked on, ones that are moving better, is having this concept of quite a small project team who can just work day to day, week to week, share ideas, get stuff done, deal with problems. But then actually you need a project steering group. And on the steering group, you might fill some of the gaps in the team's experience. So if you're creating a small business really from scratch, have you got anybody with business commercial background in your team? Maybe you haven't, but it might be a good idea to bring someone into the project steering group who's actually run a business and who's raised capital before and who knows, about VAT and tax and governance structures and that sort of thing. So maybe the project team day to day, but build a project steering group who are going to make life a little bit uncomfortable for you and challenge you and fill some of the gaps in your knowledge. So I'll leave it at that, Helen. I think there's a couple of things.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So just to clarify, just to summarize, number one, nimble, positive, entrepreneurial. The second is have that ambition towards scale, but understand that, you know, it's a long-term thing. So you're building, but it doesn't have to be straight away. Understand the landowner perspective. That's something we're actually going to pick up in the next FIRNS session. Focus on your revenue stream, no matter how small, just like when you're having any business, really, isn't it? And then make sure you have the right experience in the group, potentially through having a steering group to complement your project team where there are some skills gaps. That's really, really helpful. Just before we come to Simon, Rebecca Barr has asked a question about just, can you share some examples of the different types of revenue streams available? You've worked across multiple, so we'd love to hear them, Dan.
I think another really useful thing you can do on any project is map your potential revenue streams. And by that, I literally mean a spreadsheet which you can develop collaboratively as a team. So your project will be something that's going on in the environment. Now, where can you get revenue from? So what we do is a thing called mapping ecosystem services. So if you're doing a river restoration project, say, you know, the ecosystem services coming out of that there could be some carbon being sequestered. There could be some biodiversity being created. There could be some water quality improvements. There might be some water storage going on. There might be the ability to bring communities or the public in to spend some money on that site. There may not. So really think laterally, map all the potential ecosystem services, and then work your way across and say, right, those ecosystem services, what value do they have? Like if you're planting trees, clearly you're sequestering carbon. We've got the Woodland Carbon Code as a metric. There might we know there are large corporates busily developing their net zero transition plans this year. It's a requirement of all listed companies to do that in the UK. So lots of large corporates are looking to buy Woodland and Peatland Code accredited carbon. The challenge, though, is who does that carbon belong to? Does it belong to the landowner, or does it belong to your project? So again, it's a case of thinking about what's the revenue. Now, what can we do to monetize it? Who owns it? And what's the plan for generating a revenue stream from it? And almost create a grid, and maybe the public one, you know, are we able to offer public access to this site? If we do, are we able to monetize that in any way, or is it really just public access? You know, so I think, again, it comes down to being entrepreneurial and thinking about where can we get different revenues from. And if they belong to the landowner and we need them for the project, to fund the project, what agreements can we come to with the landowner where we do a revenue share, perhaps, around carbon and biodiversity? So that may sound a bit complicated, but it sort of makes sense, really. From the outset, you've got to think, where is that revenue coming from? Because you need revenue for your project.
Brilliant. And that's it. We have some case studies on the Investment Readiness Toolkit that will of different revenue streams. And there are actually some international examples on GFI Hive. If you're interested, we can also share some links if you want to think even a bit more outside the box. I always remember Gwyn Williams, who was at RSPB and head of conservation finance, used to talk about, if you're going to go for the model of getting the public there, it's lose, views and brews. That's what he used to say that they needed. That was brilliant. So Simon, thanks, Dan. We'll come back to you in a moment and have a bit of a conversation. And also, please do put your questions. We've got, I prefer Johnsworth, these legends with us today. So Simon, I wondered, just for those who might not know you, you could share a little bit about your experience working with projects.
Yeah, sure. I mean, compared to Dan, it seems fairly superficial, but we've gone on a bit of a journey at Esmée Fairbairn. I think most folk will probably know us as a grant funder. But we also have a £45 million social investment carve out. This is separate from our endowment that funds our grant making. And really it's a way of expanding our impact and increasing the amount of funds that we can put out to support projects. With that social investment part, the impact of what it delivers, whether that be a social or environmental impact, is absolutely as important and central as it is within the grant funding programme. But we realised, I think, that this way of working, this way of looking, because I think the critical point that Dan made around it's all about the revenues and generating the revenues, was much more advanced in the social change sector. looking at social housing and things like that than it was in the environment sector. But it didn't need to be that way. And we were working through some fairly sort of straightforward ways of supporting projects, things like bridging loans for purchasing land, that kind of thing. But actually, there was a real range of different ways that we could work and we could support projects. And actually, Dan referred to it when he was working at Triodos. He came to us and pointed out that there is this potential, but we're really early on the journey, and we need a funder that can help us with some grant funding support and potentially some sort of impact focused social investment after that, who can help to develop these projects and get them going. And since that, then we've worked well with John on IONS, which sort of was the precursor before FIRNS. We've worked on the 4 pilots that we developed with Dan in England, and we're also working in Scotland with Riverwood's Investment Pioneers, trying to look at some different ways of supporting these sorts of projects.
It really feels like whenever you look at a project that's under development across the UK, and I gather there's sort of like 150 now in development, that Esmée is either a direct link or an indirect link, but you're always somewhere in there. And obviously you're a funder of GFI as well, so which we're very grateful for. You've been really instrumental in building this, this whole emergent asset class, if you will. But you'll have seen so many applications come your way with regards to projects. So I wondered, could you share with us, what do the good applications look like? What makes them stand out for you when it comes to these nature finance projects?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing is clarity on the environmental or social impact that they're looking to have. I think that's the first thing that you have. If it's addressing a real environmental problem or a problem that communities have identified in the places where they live, that's the thing that really stands out. What doesn't stand out so much is a focus on returns for investors or kind of really clever kind of structures and models for how you're going to do it. I think, all of that stuff may, or as Dan said, all of that stuff may or may not come later on. But in terms of particularly for grant support, it is that absolute sort of laser focus on environmental impact and a good idea. And after that, I think, again, it's a point that Dan made around understanding who your buyers are. That's something that we would take a look at really early on. We don't need all of the details. I mean, that comes as projects are developed, but to know that there are buyers out there, and also if you've had conversations with those buyers, again, just exploratory conversations to understand the scope of what they're interested in, and how they'd like to work with you. I think that helps a lot. And those are probably, if I could add a third, it's probably sort of that community link. I think, again, this is speaking from Esmée's point of view, but beyond our interest in the environment, we also have an interest in empowering communities and things like that. So projects that hit both of those aims really do stand out for us.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. So clarity on the social environment impact, some early understanding that you have got a buyer at the end of whatever it is you're going to sell. And then the third was that focus on community. Maybe let's just dive into that last one a bit more. What sort of community engagement, participation, involvement, returns have you seen in some of the projects that you've been working on?
I think there's, to be honest, I think there's still quite a lot that we can explore in this space. And I think that's a really exciting thing about working in Scotland, where this is a real focus, both for government and for NatureScot. So I think we can look at that in a bit more detail. But I think there are projects, for example, Argyll and Coast Community Trust work on Isla, looking at small peatland owners who often you have big estates able to sell their peat carbon, but how do we work with smaller landowners that might own much more embedded within the community, who might have a much smaller resource, and how do we support those? I think the Riverwoods platform was really interesting. It was this idea about how do you get members of the community able to have an interact in decision making at a really early stage. So I don't know if folk are familiar with Riverwoods, but effectively everybody who wanted to put a project forward put it on an open platform, which was managed by DEMSOC and then Involve. And members of the community were able to ask questions from the project proposers, and they were able to give their views on which projects they thought really could shift the dial much easier. And if you're working with community landowners, you've got that direct link with communities. Often, as Dan alluded to, landowners are big. It can feel like they've got all of the power and all the decision-making capacity. But Riverwoods was one idea of just bringing that community voice into the sort of decision-making early on.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. I see there's please do put your questions in. We're going to have a bit of a chat at the moment about what some of the pitfalls are, where we've seen sort of projects that didn't quite work early on, so you can avoid those. There's a question here, just a clarification around what revenue stream is different to capital. So just to clarify, revenue is income from service users and can be a lump sum upfront or regular schedule of payments across time, and capital is borrowing from financiers because the initialization funds don't otherwise exist. Dan, do you want to just, can I turn to you just to make that clarification?
I think you described that perfectly, Helen, really. I mean, it's...
Well, that wasn't me, that was the questioner, so I can't take credit.
Okay, well, the question has described it perfectly. It is exactly that. Revenue is sales. It's, you know, ongoing revenue which can pay other costs and repay investment. Investment is generally, so imagine if you're starting a business, you need some customers who are going to buy your products. Those customers are creating a revenue stream for your business. You might, though, need to borrow some money from the bank to set up your business, and the bank is going to want you to repay that money. That's investment. So if you can set your business up and generate a revenue stream without having to borrow money from the bank, that's a good thing, isn't it? Because you don't have to repay that money. So that's what the difference between revenue and investment. Revenue is essential, and investment is a means to an end. It's not the end goal of these projects to raise investment, but you might need investment to get your project off the ground.
Well, maybe let's just stick on that point then. If we need investment to get the project off the ground, in what sort of circumstances, just so everyone's clear?
Yeah, so it might be that you want to do a peatland restoration project, and you've agreed with the landowner that they're up for that. And you have realised that there are some ecosystem services that can be sold, and that could be water storage, there's some carbon, CO2 emission reductions, and there's some biodiversity, which will help fund the peat restoration project. You may also have a government grant in the mix there as well. We're not talking exclusively about all private money. There's a blend sometimes of, you know, charitable money, public and private. But the money, the revenue from those ecosystem services, from the carbon, the biodiversity, the water storage, might not come in on day one. It might be that all the buyers of those services say, well, we actually want to see you do the restoration project first, prove to us that it's completed in accordance with the plan. And we might want to do some measurement and monitoring of certain things as well. So you're going to get our money in year 2, 3. So you might still need some capital up front to do your restoration project. So you might want to go to the nature investment market and borrow some money to actually do the restoration and repay that money by ultimately selling those ecosystem services.
And that will be typically through a loan, maybe a bank loan, or perhaps something bigger like a stake.
Yeah, we're sort of moving on to what's the structure of your project, really. So you might well set up some sort of project vehicle. And we might want to talk about this, but let's just say you've set up a community interest company as a project vehicle. You would attract investment into that community vehicle. You might also get a government grant into that vehicle that funds the restoration, and then the revenue stream is through contracts with the vehicle, and that ultimately repays the investment. So you need some sort of vehicle to actually handle contracts and money. And that will be part of your project as well, working out what your governance structure is and how you'll actually deliver your project. That's something wasn't in my top 5 that I outlined earlier on, but it is definitely one of the nuts and bolts that you've got to work through.
Brilliant. And I encourage you to ask some questions on that if you have them. We are touching on it in later sessions around that sort of governance structure, and then and some of the points Dan raised around that investment. But maybe there's a question here around compliance markets, and then I've got a couple more about some of the pitfalls. So Johnny, I'm going to come to your second question in just a moment, but first I just wanted to ask Simon and then Dan about what have you found the biggest pitfalls in that project development in the first 6 months to be? Simon, did you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, sure. possibly internal capacity, sort of fairly early on. I think a lot of proponents of developing these really exciting ideas are conservation NGOs for whom their bread and butter is delivering the actual sort of land management change, but for whom this thinking about working with corporate partners and stuff is new, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of and building that capacity in early on is really important. I think the other thing is probably that these are partnerships, usually, nearly always. In fact, always they're going to be a partnership of some form or another. And partnership working always takes more time, but that's when you know all of the partners, and they may be other NGOs thinking like you. These are different partnerships with corporate drivers, and taking the time to understand that, I think is a little, it takes a little bit of time to bed in.
Thank you. That's great. Internal capacity, partnership building can take a while to build in. Dan, what about you?
I think that it's not so much a pitfall, it's like a big challenge in these projects that you've got to almost look both ways. One side, you've got to come to some sort of arrangement with a landowner, and landowners generally at the moment are faced with a lot of different choices, aren't they? With changing subsidy regime, potential for accessing carbon markets, ecosystem services markets. A lot of landowners are faced with a lot of uncertainty, and therefore they maybe don't know where to go for advice. And when there's uncertainty, they tend to sit on their hands. And that's a real big challenge, is actually you've got a great project. You've even got some buyers lined up, corporates that want to buy carbon or invest in biodiversity and things like this, but you can't get the landowner to commit to that long-term management change. So that, I think, universally in all the projects I'm working on, which are often about peat restoration or river restoration, natural flood management, getting landowners on side, really understanding them, takes a lot of time, and you really need to understand their perspective. And often they'll come back and say, well, there's three things you need to sort for me. One is, are there any tax implications of me moving away from farming into nature? Another one might be, well, I've got a rolled over DEFRA grant for another 5 years. If I end up doing some river restoration, is that going to interfere with my income stream from my grant from DEFRA? You know, so you need to get something from DEFRA to tell me I can do that. And also, you know, if I sell some carbon now and commit to something for 50 years, what am I passing on to my kids? What does that do to the value of my land? These are really fundamental questions that landowners have. And if we want to do landscape change on private land, we need to get in there and try and work out how we can address some of those challenges with landowners. And I think talking to them is quite, and you need to find the right routes to talk to those landowners. So I think that's a big challenge in most projects, actually. If you are a landowner yourself and you're developing a project, you don't have to go through that because you've already thought of that. So a landowner-led project probably has a running start ahead of non-landowner-led projects.
Yeah, for sure. It's an easier lift, isn't it? Actually, when I'm thinking about some of the NERF projects, they had great ambitions and landowners early on and were like, yeah, in theory. And then when it actually came down to working with them, it wasn't quite, you know, for the reasons you mentioned, tax implications, the implications of losing potential government subsidies, and then that ultimate value of their land can be a real issue. Thank you for those. Again, just before we come to Johnny's question, I think, to what extent have you seen there's a bit of a lack of price transparency, I suppose, around some of these revenue streams at the moment. So when you're starting your project, is it best to be conservative about the kind of pricing that you think you're going to get that might be able to pay back? How would you approach that? Do you even need to think about that in that very early stage?
Shall I have a go at that, Helen?
Yeah, thanks, Sam.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. There is a little bit of, you can see it just from Googling around, really. There's a sort of indications of what the carbon market might be. And that's quite interesting. You might say that on woodland carbon code projects, it seems to be that the quarterly auctions are around about £20 to £25 a tonne of carbon. No one's quite sure what the value of peatland code projects are. But if you look behind Aviva's partnerships with the Woodland Trust and the Wildlife Trust, and you're a bit of a finance person like me, and sort of try and look between it, it looks to be around about £30 a tonne. And then you look at the UK emission trading scheme, which all the airports and hospitals and things are on, like the EU one. If the companies on there don't achieve their net zero targets, they're required to buy carbon emissions from the government at £90 a tonne. So And then we hear about biodiversity net gain, and DEFRA think that a unit might be between £11,000 and £25,000 per unit. So there's a lot of ad hoc, anecdotal stuff around pricing of biodiversity and carbon. Things like water storage, natural flood management, those are much more bespoke to the particular project. So I think it's not really that helpful to try to use sort of standard market metrics. They're just not there at the moment. And instead, what you want to try and do really is properly develop your project, engage landowners, engage the buyers, and have a very open conversation with the buyers in particular and say, look, for us to deliver this project and deliver you the carbon, the biodiversity, the reduced flood risk, we need this amount of revenue. What part can you play in this? And it might be that corporates supporting a project like yours aren't simply buying it for the lowest price carbon. You probably wouldn't want them if they were. So there's slightly more to it than that. There's more of a, we want to support the project. Yes, we can take the carbon credits. Yes, we can get some good publicity around our ESG. We might be able to do some volunteering days with our staff, but ultimately we're prepared to support this project for a bit of a bundled price to support the project. So I don't think it's as clear as just standard markets, really. We're not into just trying to create carbon trading through these projects, are we?
No, thanks. That's really helpful. Simon, anything you wanted to add on that before we go to Johnny's question?
No, I think the other, and this is another example of a bespoke sort of revenue stream, but in England, we're seeing some really exciting opportunities for particularly wetland creation from nutrient neutrality regulation. And in that case as well, the price of the project is probably bespoke to what the demand is from developers to be able to demonstrate their neutrality and be able to carry on their development. So it's just, I think, another example of where some of them are very site specific, very place specific.
Thank you. So Johnny, finally to your question, I see David Tollick has answered it also in the chat, but Johnny says, interested in hearing thoughts on whether operating in compliance markets, such as biodiversity offsets for planning applications, changes the project development process in any way, i.e. not quite the same relationship with ROI, investment and revenue. And I'm conscious that there are fewer compliance markets in Scotland. So maybe we'll come back to sort of biodiversity credits more generally rather than biodiversity net gain units as well, to sort of look at some of the other options for Scotland. But Dan, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I think it's useful that there are these emerging regulatory markets. Biodiversity and nutrient neutrality, as Simon said, seem to be the two which are jumped to the top of my mind as the main regulatory markets, because those are bringing buyers of those ecosystem services to those markets, not voluntarily, but because they have to. So it's really useful for when you're developing a nature-based project that if you can deliver those services to those buyers, you're delivering something they want and they need. So I think it just brings into light that you're maybe in a slightly stronger position to offer them something. Again, I think the pricing of the units will be more site specific, and in the case of BNG, quite early. You know, we're still in England in advance of when it becomes mandatory in November. But I do know that local authorities and developers are doing a huge amount of work thinking about how they can secure a stream of biodiversity credits, and the recognition that pre-existing habitat uplift and credits already in existence count for more than ones that haven't been created yet. So there's lots of sort of, again, being entrepreneurial about it. You know, if you're a landowner and you're moving early, you should do your baseline, do your uplift now, measure the uplift. You've effectively banked those units. Those units have at least twice the value of units you might create in future because you've already created them. So there's a lot of opportunity here to be quite entrepreneurial in projects and engage local authorities and developers and say, actually, I've created a BNG bank here. It's in existence. You can come and look at it. You can audit it. A local authority would probably be more amenable to signing off a planning application where there's an arrangement to buy those credits because they're already in existence and there might already be a management plan around them. So I think regulatory markets is really, really helpful for the whole space we're in. It is more advanced in England than Scotland, but I think during the course of these FIRNS projects, I think probably the Scottish government will probably announce policies which might coincide with these FIRNS projects developing. So that's going to be quite useful.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because, you know, one, as you say, you've got a captive audience because if there's a regulatory demand driver, but also you can sort of start to think about maybe there are some demand drivers where you are that aren't regulatory yet, but might be coming, or even they're just demand drivers just because of what's happening in that particular local area. So I think it's a great point. Thank you, Johnny, for that. Thanks for being patient. One from Chris Fry. Oh, sorry, Simon, please.
Just really quickly, and I suppose there probably aren't very many government officials or politicians listening to the webinar, but one of the things that's really critical is that the government holds its nerve on underpinning these regulatory markets. I mentioned the nutrient trading one before. There's been an awful lot of government upheaval in certainly at Westminster, and that sort of the regulations underpinning that nutrient neutrality one looked at risk, and all of a sudden you had developers saying that they couldn't do this. And they can do this, and if government that we can find creative ways of working, but it does depend on certainty both for the developers and both for the project developers in that space.
Thanks, Simon. I'll just chime in here. So if you've missed it, we announced a few weeks ago that we're working with Bank of England on assessing UK nature-related risk and the exposure across the UK to it's like a financial exposure, and it will dive down into sectors. So I think that's going to be a really big signal as well to governments to look at their policy around which companies have very high dependencies on nature and are having very high impacts on nature. So I think the future may be a lot more of these enforced demand drivers, if you will. So there's a question thanks, Simon. A question from Chris Fry. Reforming up the structure for the ultimate delivery, e.g. community interest companies. Interested in hearing Dan and Simon's perspective on the timing of this. Various partners we work with are finding this a challenging area vis-a-vis existing organisational structures and remits. Thank you.
Yeah,
Dan, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's good to think about how you're going to deliver your project quite early on, because you might want to communicate that to all the stakeholders. And for me, the default option is always, I'm just being honest here, is always a community interest company straight away, because it has all the benefits of a limited private company, but obviously it has an asset lock in it, which demonstrates you are looking to benefit the local community or the local environment with the asset lock. And there are lots of different types of community interest company. You could have one which is wholly owned by one shareholder. So you can actually take profits and dividends out of a community interest company. There's just a cap on what you can do. You can go all the way to the other end and have a community interest company which has no shares. It's limited by guarantee. So really all the profits will go into the asset lock. So you've got flexibility within using a community interest company. It's a visible demonstration that you are looking to reinvest the surplus into the local community in the area, which is often what the grant providers and Esmée, Fairbairn and Heritage Lottery will like. So that's a really good, safe option to start your project with. And then you can firm up exactly what type of kick, who's going to be on the board and how it's going to work a bit later on. And I would say you don't actually need to set that company up or spend time recruiting directors early on, because you've got far more important things to do, which is actually develop your project and make sure that it's going to work. So I think there's nothing wrong in saying to people what you're going to do in terms of delivery up front, but actually only at the point you really are ready to sign contracts and take on investment do you actually need to set the vehicle up, would be my view. Because often the grant you've received probably comes into one of the organisations who's part of the project. It wouldn't normally come into a brand new company. It would normally come to an NGO or a community group.
And I think maybe in the background, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we actually have a webinar where we've gone with you there, Dan, where we talked about kicks and cost of starting kicks and when you start a kick in the process that you're in. So maybe if we find it, we can share that link. I just wondered, just for, as this is sort of like the sort of back to basics webinar, can you just explain an asset lock?
Yeah, an asset lock is a clause in the Articles of Association of the community interest company, and it's also part of the community interest company legislation. And what it says is that the retained profits of that company will be reinvested in accordance with the objectives of the asset lock. And then in your articles, you define what the asset lock is. So on the wire catchment project, for example, the one I worked on, The asset lock is that we say all retained profits will be reinvested into the wire catchment for the benefit of local communities and the resilience of the catchment. So it's quite a broad clause, but that's there visible. So anyone who wants to go onto Companies House and see what the wire catchment project's all about and what's running it, they can go on, look at the articles and see that clause, and then have probably a bit of trust that that company, and then the directors are required to manage the company in accordance with its articles and its objectives. So that almost sets the direction, if you like, of what the company's set up to do.
Great. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and there's a couple of questions have come in, and then I've got a question around just sort of, you know, what are the, well, I'll tell you in a minute, you'll be surprised. But there's a couple around biodiversity net gain. Obviously, people are interested. We think Scotland will follow. I don't think any of us want to go on record as saying yay or nay, but I'll leave that to the panelists to decide. John, if you'd like to come in here, we'll bring you in. Are developers legally obliged to decrease their impact before offset? So building in a way that's inherently sustainable. If not, the thought of receiving money for biodiversity credits feels uncomfortable and not entirely ethical. We're talking about biodiversity net gain units in that instance and not credits by the sound of it. So should we sort of take just take a quick BNG comment from the panel on either of those two? Anyone feel? John's waving.
Yeah, I suppose I'm the one who's closest to government, so I should try and answer. So, well, I think, it's already been answered in a sense. So we have National Planning Framework 4, and which sets out a policy-based approach to what is called in England biodiversity net gain. In Scotland, we call it positive effects for biodiversity, and the policy objective of development leaving biodiversity in a better state than it was beforehand. However, it's not like in England. It will be, as Dan said, mandatory, regulatory. You know, the policy doesn't have quite so many teeth. So we're in a slightly different place to England, and the other thing I would say is that the built development sector in Scotland is nothing like as big as it is in England. You know, so you know, that's one reason why government has not gone for a kind of harder edged regulatory approach. So we'll see how it works. There's work going on in Scotland at the moment to think about metrics. You know, the DEFRA metric is kind of the default. It can work in Scotland. We're trying to think about how it might need to be tweaked to suit the Scottish environment. But you know, the aspiration is to have a metric that operates in Scotland and serves, or rather, maybe probably a set of metrics actually, because there's no one metric that will fulfill every requirement. Could I go on to Sophie's question as well?
Yeah, go for it.
So this business about the mitigation hierarchy, I think, Sophie, is what you're getting at. To eliminate or reduce emissions, for instance, or to take your impact on biodiversity down to the minimum before you start to do things like offsetting. So there's a lot of, the carbon markets, there's a lot of discussion around this at the moment. And I think, I think some degree of regulation is probably coming, that will require buyers of carbon credits to have, for instance, a science-based strategy to reduce emissions, to avoid greenwashing, so that offsets are doing the job that they can do, and not substituting for the job that needs to be done elsewhere in terms of actually reducing emissions. The biodiversity markets, as we've heard, are not so well developed, so we're not in that space yet. But of course, as a seller, you have some control over who you sell to. You can make demands of your buyers in order to increase the integrity of the product that you're selling and the overall integrity of the market. So think it's it's a process of negotiation at the moment, I think.
Yeah, thanks, John. And there are buyer standards sort of being developed by NGOs. I think the World Carbon Standard also has sort of a buyer standard built in within it. You can look to other projects on how they work with buyers. I would be certain that Trees for Life has a standard around who it works with as a buyer, given its values and integrity. So there's just 4 minutes left. So David, I'm going to leave yours because it's it's less of a basic question for this particular webinar, but hopefully we can pick it up in a couple of the others to come. Alistair, I'm just going to quickly answer this one. I know that UKIB, the UK Investment Bank, has done a loan to Highlands Rewilding that was announced a couple of weeks ago. Scottish National Investment Bank, I believe they are talking about lending and investing. I don't know if anyone here has heard anything different to that out of the SNIB. John?
Yeah, they are interested in lending and learning. Two things with SNIB. One is that it's got a slightly less, its risk appetite is lower than UKIB, and as defined by the government, which set it up. So it has to operate on pretty much commercial terms. They can have a longer time horizon, and there are ways in which they can take on a little bit more risk, but fundamentally they're operating commercially. The other restriction for SNIB is and for UKIB even more is that they're looking at big tickets. You know, they're not interested in fussing around with, you know, tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands. You know, so you know they're very much interested in large scale investment, which may not suit, or probably almost certainly will not suit most of the people who are interested in applying for FIRNS at this point.
Thank you. So we're going to wrap up. I'm going to ask for closing remarks to everyone. If you've got something to say, please say it. Otherwise, I might as a suggestion. What shouldn't you do in your application? Or like worst things you've ever seen without dropping anyone in it. But in the meantime, Phoebe's going to post the link to the next webinar. That's going to be about how you work with landowners. So please do sign up for that. And thank you all for coming today as well. So just on any closing remarks, Simon, I'll come to you first.
Okay, in terms of things not to do, if you were looking for funding from Esmée Fairbairn,
or
don't make it
anyone.
all about don't make it all about the investment. Make it about the impact you're going to achieve.
Brilliant, thank you. Dan?
Yeah, I think I'd just say be positive. I think in the 3 or 4 years I've been working in this space, there's more and more corporate interest in ecosystem services, and some of that is driven by regulation and TNFD and things like that. But you know, voluntary water storage, biodiversity, carbon, you know, these are all, corporates are more and more interested, and this is starting to become more operational business as usual for corporates, rather than it used to just be a bit of CSR over here. It's becoming more mainstream, and there's evidence that, you know, listed companies with high ESG standards are valued higher than those that aren't, and you're starting to see executive pay now linked to delivery of ESG targets. So actually restoring nature and the environment in the private sector starts to become business as usual. So the demand is out there. And I think it's a really positive thing if you're developing a project. And obviously you've got government and public support for all this. So it's all to play for, is what I'd say. Yeah,
get in there now. Get in there now, and thank goodness for FIRNS. John, any closing remarks? And thank you. I saw you were starting to reply to David. Apologies, I think I slightly misunderstood the question, David. John, anything you want to say?
Just thank you to yourself, to Simon and Dan for helping out today and imparting their wisdom, and to everyone who's asked such great questions. Look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, which is on engaging with landowners, which was mentioned earlier as one of the key challenges. So do come along. We've got another great lineup.
Yeah, well, thank you to this legendary panel. We will be sharing the recording and also a summary of today. So if you wanted to recommend it to other people, we'll give you all the information on how you might still be able to watch it. And so thanks all. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And again, thank you so much, Simon and Dan, for joining us.
See you, everyone.
Thanks all.
Bye everyone.